The question is that the motion be agreed to. Call Phil Twyford.
Mr Speaker, I didn't hear in that contribution from the Minister any kind of convincing explanation for why the Select Committee period for this bill should basically be cut in half. This is, in spite of the fact that it is a bill, sir, that is disappointing, as we've been saying for the last couple of hours in the debate, disappointing in its potential impact, it still has some complexity. And I would have thought this bill deserves and needs proper scrutiny and review at Select Committee. And other than the government's bad planning, I've yet to hear any reason why the Select Committee process should be cut in half. And unfortunately, sir, this is typical of this government, riding roughshod over the democratic process and particularly the importance of Select Committee scrutiny of their bills. We saw the same kind of contempt for process this morning in the Foreign Affairs estimates hearing when we basically saw a collusion between the Minister and the committee chair shutting down debate.
Order. This is a very narrow debate. The member said. This is a very narrow debate, and I'll refer the member to Standing Order 293, and it says there that any debate on the question or the motion under this standing order is restricted to the special powers or instructions set out in the motion. It may not extend to the principles, objects or provisions of the bill to which the motion relates. So talking about the Select Committee process is not part of this debate. Phil Twyford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. What I would submit is that by cutting the Select Committee review period in half, what the government is doing is denying a lot of people, members of the public who have a big interest in this bill and the issues that this bill purports to address. They are going to be denied their opportunity to have a proper say. There's no doubt about that. And you think about the people who will have strong views about this bill. There are approximately 300,000 people who own rental property in this country. They're going to have a lot to say about this bill. Almost every city and region around this country has a branch of the Property Investors Association. They will all have strong views about this. Think about the real estate companies, Barfoot and Thompson, Harcourts, Harveys. Somebody like Shamabeel Yaqub, the eminent economist who recently published the book Generation Rent, explicitly dealing with the kinds of issues that this bill purports to represent. He's the kind of expert opinion the Select Committee should be getting in to submit on this bill. And in fact, organisations like Generation Zero, who are an articulate voice for the interests of young people in this country who feel themselves shut out of the property market because of the rampant out-of-control speculation. These groups want to see, sir, a bill that actually has some real impact on property speculators. They're going to want to come along and they will have things to say about this bill. And I have no doubt in my mind, sir, that they will have views about whether or not simply requiring property purchasers, offshore speculators, for example, to provide a bank account number and register with the IRD. They are going to have views about whether that in itself constitutes a substantive, serious and credible response. We've seen far too much poor legislation rushed through this House. And what happens? Every time it comes back to this House, and we saw it recently, we've seen it in the last day or so with the exclusive economic zone legislation that Nick Smith made a complete hash of. And this House, at huge taxpayer expense, has to come back and clean up the mess that is left by legislation, sir. And it's my fear that this bill has been so rushed. It was a last-minute, cobbled together, poll-driven panic before the budget. And we know that. We know that because Louise Upston didn't know about it until a few days before the announcement. The minister who's responsible for shepherding this bill through, and it's her officials that will be responsible for servicing any of the work that's done on this bill as it goes through the Select Committee process. She didn't even know about it until a few days before the announcement. So she had no say in it. It was imposed on her as a panicked political measure. And I think, Mr. Speaker, that this House deserves better. And this is an issue, as so many people have said in this debate, people feel incredibly strongly about all over New Zealand. The fact that we have a housing crisis that's out of control. It's of an intense public interest. So for the Minister to stand up and say that this taxation bill deserves only half the normal period of scrutiny, I think is shabby. In spite of the fact that we've argued, sir, I think consistently that this is a half measure, we've quoted the commentators, the analysts who have said publicly that they don't believe it's going to make much difference to the problem of property speculation. There are issues of some complexity in the drafting of this bill. And you only need to look at what the Inland Revenue Department said, sir. But so these are matters of complexity that go right to the heart of the fact.
You can mention that, but you can't get into the detail of the bill. That's the point that I made earlier.
Okay, I'm just saying, Mr. Speaker, that Inland Revenue, the government's own advisors on tax matters, have said, and I want to quote what they said about it, because these are the very issues that will have to be dealt with at Select Committee. The IRD recommended to the government that they do not exempt main homes from the register because it will not reduce compliance costs for the purchasers of a main home, as almost all of those people will already have an IRD number anyway. And what Inland Revenue said is that what it will do is it will make the rules more complicated for purchasers and conveyancers and create loopholes. So, for example, a person could buy, quote, a main home.
Order. Look, I've explained to the member that this is a very, but there's a truncated report back period, and you're doing well up until you start to get into the detail of the bill. That's what you can't actually get into. So you must, it's a very restricted debate. And that's really where you need to focus. So it's limited in its content, and you concentrate, as you were doing, the reasons, the pros or cons for a truncated report back period. So you can't get into the detail of what is in the bill and what IRD is saying. So, Phil Twyford.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Point of order, the Honourable David Parker.
With respect, I agree that you can't discuss the pros and cons of the detail of the bill, but you can discuss that the bill is so detailed that it ought to have a proper select committee process.
If the member, I agree with that, and that's why I said to what the member was saying for his first 8 minutes, is that he's been on track, and you must relate it back to why in the motion is it the reasons, the pros and cons for it being truncated. But when you start specifically get into what IRD is saying, while it's fine to say that IRD has concerns, and that's the reason why you need to have a longer time for people to have the opportunity to submit. That sort of thing's fine, but you were starting to get into the detail. Phil Twyford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Actually, in what you just said, Mr. Speaker, I think you've accurately summarised my argument. What I was simply seeking to do by quoting Inland Revenue is to make the point that my colleague, the Honourable David Parker, underlined, and that is there are matters of complexity in this bill that mean that it is not justifiable for the government to cut the normal select committee period in half. Inland Revenue have made a number of comments in the regulatory impact statements that suggest that the select committee will have some serious work to do. The government made some choices as they scrambled together this measure in the few days before the budget announcement, but it's clear that some of those choices were arguable, and there's a number of issues that I was just beginning to relay where Inland Revenue have advised the government, advised them, but the government chose not to accept Inland Revenue's advice. For example, Inland Revenue said that the requirement to have a New Zealand bank account to obtain a New Zealand IRD is unnecessary for individuals and of limited benefit because Inland Revenue already has the power to require that. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm not arguing the pros and cons of the bill. I'm simply saying that there is sufficient complexity and matters of real debate and argument contained in this bill that it's going to take weeks and weeks of proper select committee scrutiny to tease these matters out. Expert advice will be needed, and there's no question in my mind that not only members of the public and organisations who have a keen interest in fixing the housing crisis and dealing with the scourge of property speculation, but also expert opinion. Tax lawyers, tax advisors will want to come in and have their say, sir. We've had enough in this House of ministers like Nick Smith rushing half-baked measures through. We need good, thoughtful, ordered approaches with real solutions to the housing crisis, and we deserve a better select committee scrutiny than we've been given.
I call Jan Logie.